Then Jesus, therefore, wearing the robe and crown of thorns, went forth, and Pilate said unto them, Behold the man. He's just been scourged. That Roman flagellum, whichever term you choose to use for it, the whip with various particles of lead or glass at the end, intended to bruise, to split, to torture, has been used on our Lord with an untold number of stripes. They put the crown of thorns upon his head. They put that purple robe upon his back. They've smitten his face. They've mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. And Pilate has just told the people, I bring him out so that you can know I find no fault in him. Behold the man. The word translated behold is hide. It's an extended form of orao. And the word itself in its basic form carries the idea of to stare, to look intently upon. But this particular form, the hide form of it, or hide form, is an interjection. It's second person plural, and it's imperative. Yet it's spoken as a singular. He's speaking to the crowd as a whole, as an entity, as one. Behold the man. Not just take a peek, not take a look. Stare at him. Look intently. Focus. And we shall. Behold the man. Pilate had a purpose as he made the declaration. John had a purpose as he records it decades after the fact. The reaction of the crowd, John 18:6, the chief priests and the officers, they saw him. They saw. They looked, they stared, they beheld, and they said, Starosin, crucify. Crucify. Can you imagine? Beholding the weakened, tattered, beaten form of an individual with a crown of thorns on his head, a purple robe across his back, and in seeing all that he's endured, carry such angst and anger to be able to shout, that's not enough. Crucify. Would you join in that cry? Would you shout alongside them, crucify, crucify? Let's consider what they beheld. And in so doing, we want to consider it from three perspectives. The reason three perspectives are needed, first, is because we want to look at it from the perspective of those immediately involved. What did they see? What did they behold? What was right in front of their faces? What should they have seen? But also, we want to keep in mind the context of this gospel account itself. We're looking at the gospel record recorded by the Apostle John. John wrote some 60 years after the crucifixion of Christ. John wrote after Matthew, Mark, and Luke have all been penned and recorded. And whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptics because they appear so similar, John's gospel record contains various details never mentioned in the other gospel accounts and numerous repeated details not mentioned in the others. John omits what the others include and includes what the others omit. John's purpose, not only for his epistles that would come later, but for the gospel record, is to emphasize identity, emphasize evidence. Because one of the problems taking place and brewing in John's day is a growing heresy known as Gnosticism, or it would become known as Gnosticism. And as John pens what he pens, he does so to combat the Gnostic idea of special knowledge, a knowledge they've not obtained except for through their own imagination. The Gnostics did not care about evidence. They claimed to be the knowing ones. They were the know-it-alls, yet what they knew, they only knew from their whims. And part of their beliefs included the idea that what is physical is inherently evil, what is spiritual is inherently good. Thus, there had to be a disconnect between deity and humanity. The almighty, physical, spiritual God could not come into contact with a material universe. And so the idea of a God in the flesh, Jesus, was beyond their comprehension. Thus they concluded that Jesus was either just an apparition or that he was just a man, and that the Spirit descended on him for a period of time but left him. John, in writing what he writes, will pen this record, supplying a perspective from the immediate involved individuals. Also supply a perspective that needs to be considered for that haughty heresy that was taking place in the day, the know-it-all Gnostics. But let's also consider it from the perspective of an aged apostle. John, in his 80s, perhaps 90s at this point, looking back over the life of Christ and the events that he saw, does so with a certain maturity that wouldn't have been possessed by the young man that said to Jesus, "Lord, shall we call down fire upon them like Elijah did?" John writes with the maturity that comes with hindsight. Yes, he's inspired. But here's a question. Have you ever looked back on events in your life as you come into your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, your 60s, and you think about the way a certain individual may have behaved when you were in your teens or your 20s, and at that time you knew the behavior was wrong, but it was just a matter of that's wrong. Yet as time moves forward, with hindsight, you start to see perspectives. With hindsight, you start to see other influences that may have contributed to this person thinking the way he did, and in no way justifying the flawed behavior. You're able to have a bit of sympathy and a bit more patience and a bit more pity than what you possessed in those younger years. You know why grandparents are so gentle, typically speaking? Because they've endured the years of being parents. John, at this point in his life, is the one that they call the apostle of love. And he's the one that is writing from a very mature perspective of the things that he describes, those things being kept in mind. Consider the man that was being beheld. In so doing, let's back up into John chapter 18. Consider the man that's bound. John 18 begins with when Jesus had said these words, that prayer recorded in John 17. He went forth with his disciples across the brook Kidron. He's left Jerusalem. He goes across the valley or ravine between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives, and now he enters into a garden, his disciples with him. And Judas knew where this place was. Judas knew the place because Jesus oftentimes resorted there with his disciples. And Judas, having received of the chief priests a band and officers, a band, literally a Roman cohort, the mob that Judas led into the garden is composed of Jews and Gentiles, composed of Roman soldiers and Jewish officers. And as he arrives, he comes into the garden, Jesus knowing what lay before him. He went forth to them and said, "Whom seek ye?" Here they are with their lanterns and their torches and their weapons. And Jesus says, "Who are you trying to find?" They say, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I'm He." Their reply? John 18, picking up in verses 5 and 6. As soon as Jesus said to them, "I am He," they went back and fell to the ground. I don't know about you, but I can't help but read that passage and giggle just a little bit. Here's this crowd with their weapons. These are the enforcers. And they've come into the garden. They expect to have to look for Him. That's why they've got the lanterns and torches. And when He says, "I am He," they step back. And apparently the ones in the front step on the toes of the ones immediately behind, and the domino effect occurs. It's almost comical. He gives them time to stand. And He says to them, "Whom seek ye?" He asks them again, "Who are you trying to find?" They say again, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I'm He." "If you therefore seek Me, let these go their way." I've told you I'm the one you're trying to find. Let these, His disciples, go their way. That His saying might be fulfilled, which He had spoken back in John 17, "Of them which Thou, Father, hast given Me, I've lost none." Then here's Peter.
He has a sword, he draws it in, and he smites off the right ear of the servant of the high priest, and that servant's name is Malchus. Jesus chastises Peter, put your sword into its place. The cup the Father has given me, shall I not drink of it? Some things to observe. Immediately after this, they bind him. They lead him away to Annas. But for now, look at it from the perspective of those immediately involved. Who's this one you see? Well, you see one that's being arrested based on a betrayal. You see one that is in a garden, minding his own business, so to speak. And a mob comes to find him, not arrested in the daytime, not seized while teaching false doctrine. He's arrested at night, betrayed by a member of his own group, which, by the way, was against Jewish jurisprudence. There's something for you to say 3 times really fast. Jewish jurisprudence, Jewish jurisprudence. You'll get tongue-tied eventually. Here they come violating the Jewish judicial system and the approach to any sort of trial. From the very outset, they arrest him at night based on the testimony of one of his own group. And in the betrayal, Judas is described as standing with them, standing with the cohort, the mob. We see the events unfolding. First and foremost, he's betrayed, but he's bold. Let's look at it from the perspective of those Gnostics, the ones that claim they knew it all, because they have to face the arrest of Jesus and recognize that He went to it. He faced it. He did not try to run. He did not try to hide. And not only is he bold as he goes to them, he's accepting. I'm He. I've told you I'm He. And in his boldness, an entire mob falls backwards. That's not something that's going to happen unless there's a certain character about him that has left an impression. Consider betrayal. He's bold, but also benevolent. This same crowd that fell back in fear, they see him not only volunteer himself, but in so doing he says, let these go their way. He is making for certain that his apostles can leave with liberty. And then when one of those apostles draws a sword and swings for the head of Malchus and catches only part of the head, the ear, isn't it interesting that John, the one who's beheld all of this taking place, as he thinks about it, he recalls Jesus saying, let them go their way. John's one of them that gets to go his way. And in thinking back over it, the one whose ear was amputated by Peter's sword is not just a nameless individual, just a bystander. His name's Malchus. John's the only one that records this detail. And as John looks back over the events of Jesus' arrest, Malchus is not some faceless extra in the movie that is John's life. Malchus is a person. Now, we know not what would become of Malchus in the days, weeks, months, and years to follow. We know not whether he ever obeyed the gospel, but isn't it hard to imagine the man whose ear Jesus healed and put back on his head not following? Whatever the case may be, here's the Apostle John. And he's writing from a perspective that is emphasizing the benevolence of Christ. For those that would have the doubts about Jesus, they have to face His boldness. And for those in the immediate events, they have to face the fact that this all starts with a dishonest betrayal. But let's move forward. Behold the man bound, but also behold him being blamed. They lead him to Annas, who was father-in-law to Caiaphas, the high priest that same year. Annas had been high priest, but he had been deposed by the Romans. And the way the Jewish mindset worked was the high priest was to be a lifetime appointment. At least that's the way God had given it whenever He first appointed Aaron as high priest in Moses' day. But by the time we get to this era, there are Jews that see the high priest position as a lifetime appointment, but it's also become highly political. And in the time since Annas had been deposed by the Romans, there had been multiple high priests. And now Annas has managed to have his son-in-law Caiaphas serving as high priest. Thus Annas is wielding a level of influence and control. Jesus is taken to Annas first. And not only is he led there, bound and seized, but he's followed by Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved, who was known to the high priest and was able to enter into the high priest's palace, that is, courtyard. Yet Peter stayed outside, and when that disciple whom Jesus loved came back and he spoke with the damsel that kept the gate, Peter is allowed to enter. Peter sees a fire. The soldiers, the officers have started a fire. They're warming themselves because it's cold. Peter stands with them. This segment depicts Jesus taken to a court trial while Peter is going to face some courtyard temptations. And in the events that unfold, first Jesus' trial, as he stands before Annas, he's asked about his disciples and his doctrine. How many disciples do you have? How'd you gather them? And what have you been teaching? His reply? Keep in mind, they do not bring charges. They do not say, here is what you are accused of doing. Here is the accusation. No, they've already arrived at a decision of guilt. Now they're trying to find charges. They know what they want to do to him. That was already declared by Caiaphas. You take a look at John 19:12. Caiaphas was that one that had said before, it's better for one man to die so that the nation not perish. It's better for a man to die for the nation. Those words were said back in John 11:49-50. Here's Caiaphas, the high priest, who's a plotter and a conspiratory individual. Here's Jesus standing before Annas, who's looking for a charge so that they can arrive at justify their guilty verdict. And as they question him, who are your disciples? What's your doctrine? Jesus' reply, I spake openly in the world, always in the synagogue and in the temple where the Jews resort. In secret I've said nothing. Why are you asking me? They know what I've said. Ask them. He makes the perfect point in a court of law. If you're looking for evidence, then look for evidence. Don't try to bring me to testify against myself and give you the charge that you want to give. If you've brought me to court, bring forth the witnesses. Of course, they didn't respond very kindly to that. One of the officers that stood by smites him across the face. If I've spoken evil, then you bear witness of the evil. But if right, then why smitest thou me? Of course, this will essentially conclude the hearing that's held before Annas because it's been such a travesty. But while that's taking place, Peter has already been asked by the damsel at the gate, are you not one of them? And the way that the wording is given, John 18:17, she didn't ask, hey, are you one of his disciples? The Greek construction would translate for us, you're not one of his disciples, are you? The kind of question that is posed with a leading tone to it. In other words, giving Peter the perfect opportunity to say, no, I'm not, and he took it. He denied Jesus. No, I'm not one of his disciples. As Peter warms himself by the fire, another will ask him the same question, posed the same way. You're not one of his disciples, are you? No. Until one of Malchus' relatives, one of the ones that had been in the garden and seen the arrest, sees Peter and says, you were in the garden. At which point Peter, for the third time, denies, just as Jesus had said he would. Thoughts, perspectives. What should we see when we behold him? Behold him being scrutinized, put on trial to find a charge to justify a verdict. By the way, objectivity is not in this passage. There is none being exercised by the Jews. There's none being exercised really by Peter. The only one with any objectivity and honesty being exhibited here is Christ. He's scrutinized, put on a mock trial from the perspective of those with a haughty heresy, of those that claimed to have knowledge they didn't have, that decided to redefine the nature of Jesus based on their assumptions. They need to recognize his soundness. Jesus used logic, which, by the way, was something very unfamiliar to the Gnostics that claimed to possess it. Their reason was so unreasonable that it was nowhere near logic. Jesus uses sound arguments, sound questions, and a sound response when unsoundly smitten by the nearby soldier. Jesus is using rational thought processes, something to keep in mind even today. When so many have turned religion into, here's what I want to believe, let me find a way to prove it. Here's what I want to claim about Christ, let me find a way to justify it. He faces scrutiny, he uses soundness, and all the while he's being shunned. I don't know him. I don't know him. I don't know him. John, looking back from the perspective of an aged apostle, has to remember the fact that the disciple whom Jesus loved was living at a time when Jesus wasn't receiving love from anyone else. And he relates these events very factual, very succinctly. But then as the events move forward, picking up at verse 28, we've seen him blamed. Now behold the man blameless. What a travesty. That when taken before the people that claim to be the people of God, it was instant guilt, now let's find a charge. Ultimately, John's account does not record the hearings before Caiaphas before the sun rose and the hearing before Caiaphas as the sun began to dawn. Their claim that they could have 2 trials, which was required in a Jewish court, back to Jewish jurisprudence and their violation of it. They gave him 2 trials almost back to back, and in those trials, the high priest voiced a decision before the rest, again, in violation of their law. Guilty, they say. They take him to Pilate. Pilate, the Roman governor, has to come out to them because they refuse, with all of their dishonesty, with their use of betrayal, with the false witnesses that had been utilized, they've got standards to maintain. And it's the Passover, so they can't defile themselves by going into a Gentile court. Now, they'll defile themselves by going into the devil's playbook with everything they're doing to Jesus, but they're not going to defile themselves by going into a Gentile court. Hey, Christians, their behavior is not so far removed from some mindsets today. They have a checklist of what will defile them outwardly, and they couldn't care less about what defiles them inwardly. And there are those whose religion is only outward. It's about checklists and ritual and ceremony. It's about technicality instead of a committed heart that serves God, follows God, imitates God, yields to God. These individuals, with their formality approach to religion, see themselves as righteous as they engage in the gold standard of hypocrisy. So, here they are bringing him to Pilate. And when Pilate says, what's the accusation? They say, well, if he wasn't a malefactor, we wouldn't have brought him to you. Pilate says, you take him, you judge him. Well, we can't judge him. By the way, we're not able to put a man to death by our law. There's some more hypocrisy. Remember when they took up stones to stone him back in John chapter 8? They didn't hesitate to try to put him to death then. They set about to kill him back in John chapter 5. And later, they are not going to have any qualms about dragging Stephen out of the city and stoning him. They are not worried about Roman law and what they can and cannot do. Their only desire is to get Jesus dead and to get him dead that day. And they just can't manage to do it that day, so they're going to use the Romans on the end of a puppet string to do it. It's all about optics. The hypocrisy is so astounding that we can't measure it. Our law, we can't put him to death. So Pilate has Jesus brought to him. The charge, he's claimed to be king. So Pilate asked him, are you a king? And Jesus' reply is astounding because instead of answering based on his understanding of terms, he instead asked a question to clarify the question Pilate's asking. Do you say this of yourself or did someone else tell you? Because if Pilate's asking, are you a king in and of his own mindset, what he's asking is, are you some sort of a physical, secular leader? Are you a king that is going to pose a threat to Roman rule? Are you asking this of yourself, or did someone else tell you? Pilate's response, am I a Jew? Your own people have accused you. What have you done? So Jesus now answers and clarifies to Pilate what kind of king he is. You say I'm a king. And for this cause came I into the world, that I might bear witness of the truth, and all they that are of the truth hear my voice. Yes, I'm a king, and my rule is by the standard of truth. My kingdom's not of this world. If it were, then my people would fight so that I shouldn't be delivered unto the Jews. His point with Pilate, it's not a physical kingdom. It's not a physical rule per se, not in the way Pilate would think. Are you a king then? Essentially, yes. But my rule is by truth. Of course, Pilate indicates that he doesn't surrender to that rule when he replies, what is truth? But then he goes to the crowd and declares, I find no fault in the man. He's the one that goes out before the hypocritical Jews and says he's blameless, he's innocent. Accused. Accused of a charge that was not the charge that they embraced according to the other gospel accounts in the Jewish trials. No, they come to Pilate to declare something different. He's accused. Accused of a new charge and a very precisely worded charge on their part to make it appear that he's something that he never planned to be. The hypocrisy of this will become even more evident once we get into chapter 19, but for now, behold the one that's accused falsely. From the perspective of those haughty heretics of John's day and those dealing with that high-minded heresy, they need to behold the man in his authority as we look at him blameless. Because he emphasized to Pilate that his standard is truth, not whims, not compulsion, but truth. Keep in mind the Gnostics and the heretics embraced believe what I want to believe idea instead of believe where the evidence points approach. As John pens what he pens, as John records the events surrounding the declaration, behold the man, when he's bound, when he's blamed, and then when he's declared blameless, there are multiple perspectives to be considered. Yes, the accusation. Yes, the authority. But there's a reminder, he was acquitted. He was innocent. The Hebrews writer would record he was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. And John will record multiple times, not only at the end of chapter 18, but throughout chapter 19, Pilate said, I find no fault. Now, once the judge says innocent, that's it, right? Unless you're talking about a political court, which Pilate's was. Which, by the way, America's is frequently becoming. When you're looking at a political court, it's not just a matter of right, wrong, fact, fiction, innocent, guilty. It's a matter of how will the decision rendered and the judgment declared impact me, the judge. So, Jesus is declared acquitted, but even in this, there's not an end. Because the Jews say, crucify him, give us Barabbas. Pilate tries to release Jesus. They say they want someone that's actually guilty of the accusations they made toward Jesus. We come to John 19. Now let's behold him beaten. Because here's where the scourging occurs, John 19:1. The crown of thorns, the purple robe, placed across his tattered back. That back that would have been open from all of the stripes and the wounds. That back that some have described crucifixion and the results of upon the flesh and bone that are exposed as the bones protruding through flesh and muscles like white caps in a sea of blood. And on that open, tattered back, they put a rough garment of purple, that robe that they will remove, but only after it's had some time to clot against the open flesh. Here he stands. Behold the man, that's the declaration. What should they have beheld? Well, the crowd that day should have beheld humiliation. They should have seen someone that had suffered to such an extent that whatever whatever they held against Him, should that not have pricked a heart? To say, He suffered enough? Should it not have caused those that knew of their own guilt and hypocrisy to step back and say, this isn't right? Should the humiliation that He had faced, the mocking, the scourging, not have been enough? From the perspective of the false teachers of John's day when he penned, and those that were brooding and growing, they needed to face His humanity. Because you don't leave stripes on an apparition. You do not bruise a mere figment or figure. He's real. He's human. He's able to bleed. By the way, He's going to be able to die. As John conveys what he conveys, humiliation, humanity, humility. Move forward in John 19 to consider what Jesus has to say. As the Jews are saying, crucify Him, crucify Him. Pilate says, why? I find no fault in Him. The Jews say, we have a law, and by our law He should die because He made Himself the Son of God. Wait, I thought you said He was a king. He made Himself the Son of God. Now Pilate's knees are shaking. He's the more afraid. He goes and he asks Jesus, from whence comest thou? Where's your home? Where's your source? What's your origin? Jesus doesn't answer. He doesn't answer because the question isn't relevant to the charges that have been made. It's already been declared. He's innocent. Don't you answer me? Don't you know that I have the authority to crucify you or to set you free? You would have no authority, no exousia, and no power except it were given to you from above. Therefore, He that has delivered me unto you has the greater sin. The only authority you have has been given to you from up on high. And it's the ones that have brought me to you. Now, whether this is a reference to the high priest or to the Jews as a whole, the one that's delivered me to you has the greater sin. The real guilt is in those that have brought me into your court in the first place. As Jesus responds, He does so in a way that exhibits not only humility, but still His composure. Pilate continues to try to release Him, but the Jews reply and they say, well, if you let Him go, you're not a friend to Caesar. So, He made Himself a king. Pilate, when he hears that, brings Jesus out, sets them before them, and then says, behold your king. In all of this, Jesus is holding His tongue. Like a sheep before its shears is dumb, He's not opening its mouth. Humility. As He stands there beaten and battered, bloodied and bruised. Humility. As Pilate says, behold your king. Humility. There's none exhibited by Pilate. Pilate's only desire is not to be bossed around by the Jews. Yet at the same time, he's a politician. And he's trying to maintain his political position. And as a result, when he realizes that they found that string to pull pertaining to his relationship with Caesar, now he has to follow. But he doesn't like it. And so at this point, it's no longer a matter of having Jesus acquitted. It's no longer, there's never any matter of mercy with Pilate, but you don't scourge an innocent person. No, with Pilate, it's just about getting his shots against the Jews now. So he's going to insult them. Behold your king. That's not going to diffuse the situation. Pilate's not the kind that de-escalates conflict. He's the one that escalates it. He's the one that's always going to say that which is going to antagonize, and he's been doing it. Here, he aggravates it further. Yet Jesus, humility, beaten and now bleeding. Pilate delivers him to be crucified. He's taken to Golgotha. As he's taken there, there's a sign that Pilate has had written, "This is the King of the Jews." Now the Jews are upset. They say, no, say that he made himself the King of the Jews. Pilate said, what I've written. Once again, this is him just being antagonistic toward them and caring nothing about the well-being of Jesus. They crucify him. Hands stretched. Nails through the extremities and the feet. Excruciating to breathe. This is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. Feed the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. The price is being paid. You behold the man. As you behold, do you see what's taking place? Oh, the soldiers are casting lots over his garments. And as they're casting lots over his garments, there stands his mother and the disciple standing by whom he loves. His mother likely seeing a garment that she well may have sewn herself, just being a lot for the soldiers. Jesus beholds his mother. He beholds the disciple whom he loves. Woman, behold thy son. Son, behold thy mother. He makes arrangements for his mother's care to be administered, because he's not going to be around to do it. And then, I thirst, because that's the agony of crucifixion, is this intensity of thirst. After he's given that Roman Pascha drink, he says, it's finished. Tetelestai. It's done. And he gives up the ghost. He's loathed. He's being mocked. He's essentially just the rope and a piece of tug of war between Pilate and the Jews at this point. Ridiculed by soldiers, ridiculed by scribes, ridiculed by the bystanders. He's leaving. That's something that the false teachers of John's day needed to realize. He's making preparations for the fact of his departure. But notice his love. He's made preparations for his mother. He exhibited his pain with I thirst. And when he says, tetelestai, it's finished. An ancient artist would finish a piece and know there was nothing left to do and say, tetelestai, it's done, it's a success. A farmer would see a healthy animal born, tetelestai, it's a success. Jesus looks at what he's done and says, tetelestai, it's a success. It's finished. And as such, he departs. He gives up the ghost. John, looking back over this, has to remember, as he describes Jesus looking upon him as the disciple whom he loved, he also has to remember what Jesus said back in John 15. Greater love hath no man than this, and that a man lay down his life for his friends. And he's beholding the greatest exhibition of friendship the world has ever seen, to the point that the next time John will describe himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, he doesn't use the word love, agape. John chapter 20, he describes himself as the disciple whom Jesus phileo, friendship love. It's touched him. Love. A final thought. Behold him buried. They don't break his legs because he's already left. He actually died. The Jews wanted the bodies taken down because of their checklist approach to their religion. He's buried in a borrowed tomb from Joseph of Arimathea. Some thoughts pertaining to this. This is murder. And the people involved in this should have realized, had to have known, and faced the fact that they've got blood on their hands, which is one of the reasons Pilate had said, you see to it. My hands are clean. Flawed, but still a point to make. See his mortality. For those that denied the very nature of Christ, they have to face the fact that there was a body remaining that was buried. And then momentary. Because after John describes his death, he immediately begins describing the resurrection. Behold him. Now, here's a question. As we consider beholding him bound, blamed, blameless, beaten, bloodied, and then buried, remember that every aspect of that was for me, for you. Can you stand with that crowd and say, crucify him, crucify him? Do you echo their sentiments? Can you imagine? Can you bring yourself to say it? You'd better. The Father did. The Father planned it. It had to happen. Think about it from John's perspective. Looking back from an aged apostle, having to remember what he saw as a young man. There's Jesus crucified, and the whole time he's screaming, no! But eternity demands yes. And it's the same for us. But I don't know about you, I still can't bring myself to say it. I cannot bring myself to stand with that crowd and say, crucify Him, crucify Him. But I can say this, crucify me with Him. Let's put to death this me that necessitated every bit of that. Crucify me with Him. How do we do that? There's a man named Paul who would say, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, Galatians 2:20. How was Paul crucified with Christ? Romans 6:3. As many of us as were baptized into Christ, were baptized into His death. We're buried with Him by baptism into death. Crucify Him. Here's a question. Have you beheld Him? From the perspective of the crowd, from the perspective of the false teachers of John's day, from the perspective of an aged apostle, have you beheld Him? As you behold Him, are you ready to say, crucify me with Him? Maybe it's the case today you've never obeyed the gospel and it's time to become a Christian. Maybe it's the case today that it's time to come home because you're an erring Christian. Whatever the case may be, behold the man and come to Jesus while we stand and while we sing.